Hey, everybody. It is Wednesday, February 5th. You're listening to the Mo News Podcast. I'm Moshe Manunu.
And I'm Jill Wagner. This is the place where we bring you just the facts.
And we read all the news and read between the lines so you don't have to.
Moshe, we're always looking for good news here on the podcast. I want to mention daylight increases throughout February across the country. From New York City, Minneapolis, Seattle will gain more than 60 minutes of daylight throughout the month, if that's your thing.
Listen, who's against daylight? I feel like that's a very popular thing, like ice cream. You know, there's a few things in life where like it has 80 to 90% approval ratings. So ultimately we begin the month 60 minutes darker than we end the month, which means sunrise getting a bit earlier and sunset getting a bit later. And for those of you who asked me, well, what's up with that whole Trump plan on daylight savings time? My answer to you is we're only 2 weeks into the Trump administration here. So TBD on that front. But as you will find out in today's podcast, he had some other things on his mind yesterday.
He's got big plans. With that, let's get to the headlines. President Trump suggests a shocking plan for the United States to take ownership of the Gaza Strip and rebuild it and potentially permanently displace Palestinians from the territory.
Yeah, that we found out, the world found that out Tuesday evening, and we are getting reactions in by the minute here.
The president also close to getting his most controversial cabinet picks through the Senate. We're talking RFK Jr. and Tulsi Gabbard.
The Republicans are falling in line, Jill.
And to that tragic plane collision in Washington, D.C., all 67 victims have now been recovered from the Potomac River. Back to politics, Republicans taking a key step to abolish the Department of Education. And it comes as USAID missions will be closed around the world this week.
A lot of big changes within the government that we have to talk about.
And a potentially dangerous ice storm could create travel havoc from the Midwest to the Northeast. And sky-high egg prices causing at least one popular chain to raise prices. Plus, Moshe is on this day in history.
One of the more famous drummers in history makes an appearance with a band. They would take him in permanently because the existing drummer was sick that day. Some of you music experts will know the answer to this one.
Okay, let's start with a headline I don't think anyone saw coming. President Trump said Tuesday he wants the United States to take ownership of the Gaza Strip and redevelop it after Palestinians are resettled somewhere else. Trump said he isn't ruling out deploying U.S. troops to support reconstruction of Gaza, and he envisions long-term U.S. ownership of a redevelopment of the territory. The comments came as he hosted Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu at the White House. Take a listen.
The reason the Palestinians want to go back to Gaza is they have no alternative. It's right now a demolition site. This is just a demolition site. Virtually every building is down. They're living under fallen concrete that's very dangerous and very precarious. They instead can occupy all of a beautiful area with homes and safety, and they can live out their lives in peace and harmony instead of having to go back and do it again. The U.S. will take over the Gaza Strip, and we will do a job with it, too. We'll own it and be responsible for dismantling all of the dangerous unexploded bombs and other weapons on the site, level the site and get rid of the destroyed buildings, level it out, create an economic development that will supply unlimited numbers of jobs and housing for the people of the area. Do a real job, do something different.
Trump cited the devastation in Gaza for why the territory's 2 million Palestinians had to move. He said, I hope we can do something where they wouldn't want to go back to Gaza. The president adding that he'd like to see really good quality housing built for Palestinians outside of Gaza while the Strip undergoes reconstruction. Trump administration officials said Tuesday that rebuilding Gaza Strip could take 10 to 15 years realistically. Earlier in the afternoon, the president addressed reporters on the proposal.
The Gaza thing has not worked. It's never worked. And I feel very differently about Gaza than a lot of people. I think they should get a good, fresh, beautiful piece of land, and we get some people to put up the money to build it and make it nice and make it habitable and enjoyable and make it a home.
They don't want to leave, though. Palestinians say they don't want to leave.
I don't know how they could want to stay. It's a demolition site. It's a pure demolition site. if we could find the right piece of land or numerous pieces of land and build them some really nice places with plenty of money in the area, that's for sure.
And then later, after their meeting, Netanyahu, standing beside Trump, praised the president, saying your willingness to puncture conventional thinking that has failed time and time again, your willingness to think outside the box with fresh ideas will help us achieve all of these goals. And I've seen you do this many times. The Israeli prime minister adding, Israel has 3 goals: destroy Hamas's military and governing capabilities, secure the release of all of our hostages, and ensure that Gaza never again poses a threat to Israel. Hamas still leads Gaza after 15 months of war, and it's unclear who is going to lead it next. Enter Trump and this plan for a U.S. takeover. Moshe, so many issues here. We have never heard most of this before. When Trump and others first mentioned the idea, the thinking was that this would be a temporary relocation while the Gaza Strip is rebuilt. But again, by later Tuesday, the president talked about a permanent relocation of Palestinians living in Gaza, what many Arab countries are calling ethnic cleansing.
Yeah, as we record this, we should note we're just a couple hours removed from this. So people are still taking this in. It was late in the Middle East and in Europe as Trump was laying out these ideas. Probably some of them are having to listen to the press conference a couple times to confirm it's not AI, because this is very out there. Even though we do know that Trump likes to throw out extreme ideas as part of his negotiation tactics, and that's what Trump does, right? Is he throws out ideas, sometimes knowing that that's not going to be where things end, but he wants to shift the conversation. It's something called the Overton window. The Overton window is this idea in policymaking that there is a window of ideas which are sort of debated, right? On the right, on the left, somewhere in the middle. What Trump does by throwing out an idea like this is completely shift the conversation. And we've seen it time and time again. Launching tariffs on Canada, talking about a takeover of Greenland. Now we're talking about a U.S. takeover of the Gaza Strip, rebuilding the entire thing and creating what Trump says is a new place for the world's people, including Palestinians. At one point in the press conference, he says he envisions turning Gaza Strip into a French Riviera-like area on the beach there, the Middle East version of the French Riviera. He said to one reporter, I think the entire world, representatives from all over the world will be there. They'll live there. Palestinians also will live there. Many people will live there. So he shifted the conversation, even though most people, Israelis, Palestinians, the Arab world, pretty much everybody is going to say, this is not how this is going to end up. And frankly, the U.S. doesn't have the right to just take ownership of the Gaza Strip. So there's practicality issues here. There's logistics issues here. There are security issues here. How many U.S. troops will it take to secure Gaza? What political will exists in the U.S., even among Trump supporters? Remember, Trump supporters were given a promise that no new wars, no U.S. troops abroad. They elected the guy who pulled troops out of Afghanistan, was always against the war in Iraq, pulled troops out of Syria, doesn't want U.S. troops abroad. And now he's talking yesterday about putting U.S. troops in there and this huge, basically nation-building project in the Gaza Strip. Now, we know that there's a problem here that most of the world acknowledges, that you can't have Hamas running the Gaza Strip. But the idea is developing a new Palestinian leadership to take over there. So no one had the whole U.S. going to take ownership of Gaza on their bingo card here. A few things to keep in mind. One, when we talk about the Gaza Strip, what are we talking about? An area the size of Philadelphia, about 8 miles by 25 miles. 2 million plus Palestinians currently live there. Where do those 2 million Palestinians go? Problem number one in this plan. Many of them might not want to leave. How are you going to push them out against their will? Can you imagine the pictures? Who is it? American troops, Israeli troops, Arab armies pushing Palestinians out of Gaza, forcibly removing them? That's going to be challenging here. But Trump says the Gaza thing, in his words, hasn't worked out. So that's issue one. Where do the Palestinians go? The Arab countries are the Arab countries that surround the Palestinians and the Israelis there, like Egypt and Jordan. Trump has been pushing them hard. Hey, take in the refugees. The Arab governments say, no, we don't want that. Even if they privately were willing to do that, their populations are very anti-Israel. And the idea that they're helping with the ethnic cleansing of Palestinians, potentially permanently from Gaza, would be deeply unpopular across the Arab world here. Those leaders nearly all of them not democratically elected, worry about assassinations, civil war, protests, a lot of issues. Jordan is already 80% Palestinian. Egypt worried about extremism, instability. That's an issue. Trump saying yesterday, they're persuadable. I can talk to them. Trump saying at one point, I have a feeling that despite the fact that they're saying no, they will open their hearts and give us the kind of land that we need to get this done. So that's an issue. Where they go, who's willing to accept them. The logistics of this. Egypt occupied Gaza from 1948 to 1967. The Israelis occupied Gaza from 67 to 2005. The Israelis couldn't stabilize it, no matter how many troops they put in there. And so Israel pulls out in 2005. Since then, pretty quickly thereafter, Hamas takes over the Gaza Strip. You had October 7th. Fast forward 15 months of war. Israel has taken out most of Hamas, and yet they still face attacks, still face issues there, effectively an insurgency. Is the U.S. now putting its military in there? And that leads us to the next issue, Jill, which is domestic politics here. He promised MAGA, he promised voters, we're not wasting money abroad. We're going to make America great again. We're not going to send our treasure and our blood to foreign nation-building efforts. Well, what is this? This is a huge issue. Despite it just being the size of Philadelphia, this could take tens of thousands of U.S. troops to stabilize here for a very long time. And there's a long history here for those of us who have followed, the region, right? Going back to the 1980s with Lebanon. Well, several hundred American troops were murdered there by Hezbollah in suicide bombings. Iraq, insurgency issues, Afghanistan. The history of American troops in the Middle East and on Muslim land hasn't gone very well for a very long time. So just among the issues as I think about this and as people think about this that are coming up here. But again, I think the idea here from Trump is to shift the conversation, look at new ideas. You saw the Netanyahu quote there, right? He's thinking unconventionally about what to do given the issue, which is you can't have Hamas rule over Gaza if you're really looking to rebuild it.
So I've been looking at Twitter or X to try to gauge some of the reaction. And one of the common themes that I'm seeing is a lot of criticism for voters who decided to perhaps sit out the election because they were angry about Joe Biden and Kamala Harris and their policies vis-a-vis the war in Gaza and the war between Israel and Hamas, saying something along the lines of, look at this, this is what you potentially voted for or didn't vote for.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a lot of finger pointing. Ultimately, we've seen this in the numbers. The views of the Middle East, people who voted based on their views of the Middle East were pretty insignificant compared to people who voted on immigration and the economy, et cetera. But certainly, one of the criticisms you're seeing of the progressives and the far left is those that were so critical of Biden and Kamala Harris for being too pro-Israel. They're saying, well, now you have Trump here and your criticism has led to this. So I think there's a lot of finger pointing there. It's not clear that really had an impact here. Ultimately, anyone who was watching the election in the fall knew the close relationship that Trump has with the Israeli leadership there. He's hosted Netanyahu multiple times at Mar-a-Lago. He made him the first leader that he's seeing at the White House here. I think that one of the things, again, we're going to see here is this plan, as we lay it out for you, as the president threw it out there in multiple press conferences yesterday, isn't happening. But Trump is going to throw out new ideas, given what has existed for the last century hasn't worked. And that's something that, I was talking to a few folks about this yesterday, whether it's the tariff example, whether it's the blowing up of the U.S. government. Trump has run basically his entire modern political life over the last decade with the idea that things are broken and need fixing and that the existing ideas haven't worked. So he comes in with a sledgehammer and he's like, we're going to do something completely different than anything you have ever seen. How that ends up, as far as he's concerned, well, it can't be worse than the current predicament that got us into it. So he's going to throw out stuff. And so that is what we've seen here. Ultimately, there are questions, what is the Trump view of international law? We're a democracy. You can't just take ownership of the Gaza Strip or Greenland or the Panama Canal. There are certain rules by which the world has existed here for a while. And the U.S., as a beacon of democracy and freedom, et cetera, has been seen as the leader of that. So I think there's a lot of questions there. There's certainly accusations out there that this is all a distraction because, this is, look over here so you don't see what else he's doing over there. I think Trump is pretty transparent. These press conferences, these rolling press conferences that he has in the Oval Office, where he just takes questions, sometimes for an hour at a time, and he's like, "Ask me anything." And we've been watching it happen. So he's open about, what he wants to do to dismantle parts of the U.S. government. He's open about this foreign policy agenda. Also, I should note, Jill, as we leave the Middle East here, he was asked, does he support Israel striking Iran in regards to preventing them from having a nuclear weapon? His answer, let's see what happens. We can't let them have a nuclear weapon. He did sign a presidential memorandum yesterday that he says restores maximum pressure on Iran, aims to deny them a nuclear weapon. He was asked at one point, what happens if Iran assassinates you or any other leader? And by the way, we know that Iran has had a plot to assassinate him, along with other folks who served in his first administration. And he says he has left plans in case of his death for J.D. Vance and the U.S. government. But it would not end well for Iran, he says. So remarkable day, remarkable statements yesterday. How this all ends up, I don't know, but still fascinating to watch. And, again, we will watch today. What will be the reaction out of the Middle East? What will be the reaction on Capitol Hill, particularly among Republicans, as well as among his supporters, who again voted for the guy who was saying at every stop, no wars, no, troops abroad. It's all about America.
Okay, staying in Washington, D.C., where it's looking like two of President Trump's most controversial cabinet nominees are getting closer to getting confirmed. So let's start with RFK Jr. The Senate Finance Committee voted 14-13 in a party line vote to advance his nomination. So that means it's now up to the full Senate to vote on whether to confirm him as Health and Human Services Secretary. His odds got a lot better after a Republican holdout, Senator Bill Cassidy of Louisiana, announced his support. So Cassidy is a physician. During the hearings last week, he talked about his experiences with patients who had lifelong health consequences because they didn't get vaccinated. Cassidy also said pediatricians have serious concerns about RFK Jr. running HHS, specifically that he'll weaken vaccination rates, which would lead to more outbreaks and deaths. But on Tuesday, Cassidy seemed to have a change of heart. He wrote on social media, "I've had very intense conversations with Bobby and the White House over the weekend and even this morning. I want to thank Vice President J.D. Vance specifically for his honest counsel." He added that he decided to vote in favor of Kennedy after receiving commitments from the Trump administration and, quote, "the opportunity to make progress on the issues we agree on, like healthy foods and a pro-American agenda." So we can expect the full Senate to vote on RFK Jr.'s confirmation at the end of the week, possibly next week as well.
Yeah, what was looking like a very uphill climb, very unlikely confirmation, the betting, the conventional wisdom is that Kennedy, given all the opposition on both sides, might go down here. But it looks like he is going to get through. He has tried to distance himself from his very long history of various vaccine theories, in some cases false conspiracy theories, and some interesting messages here on social media yesterday. Trump, who's a huge advocate for Kennedy, writing 20 years ago, autism in children was 1 in 10,000. Now it's 1 in 34. Wow, something is really wrong. We need Bobby. We should note the scientific and public health consensus and all the studies have shown that childhood vaccines do not cause autism. And effectively, at times, they have gotten Kennedy to acknowledge that, despite the fact that he has said that. At the same time, Trump has said he wants Kennedy in there to go crazy, to go nuts as Health and Human Services Secretary. And that is what concerns some folks, including Cassidy, who's a doctor. But it looks like Cassidy's been convinced. He's been promised regular meetings with Kennedy, that Kennedy's had a sort of change of heart here. And that's not it. He was not the only nominee. That looks like he's going to squeak through here. We saw Hegseth get through. He sort of opened the door here for some of the more controversial nominees. Now Kennedy. And then you had some really positive developments for the Tulsi Gabbard nomination yesterday, after she was among many of those where there were early signs that these would be derailed by a handful of Republicans, lack of experience, disturbing paper trails and comments, character issues. But the resistance has collapsed here.
Yeah, so the Senate Intelligence Committee approved Gabbard for Director of National Intelligence at a private vote Tuesday, which means, like RFK Jr., she's now going to go to the full Senate for consideration. For her, it was a crucial boost from Republican Senator Todd Young of Indiana. He announced that he would support her. Young even posted a letter online saying that Gabbard committed to holding accountable any intelligence community employee, contractor, or subcontractor who leaks intelligence. During her hearing last week, Gabbard would not call Edward Snowden a traitor. So this was a huge issue. Snowden is the former NSA intelligence contractor and whistleblower who violated the Espionage Act by leaking a trove of classified information. So Young says that Gabbard also committed to working with the committee to reauthorize Section 702 of the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act, which is a controversial power that has been used to spy on Americans. And Moshe, it is looking like J.D. Vance, the vice president, played this very big role here in getting some of these more hesitant senators on board with both Gabbard and RFK Jr.
Yeah, blocking and tackling for the nominees here in his old confines over in the U.S. Senate. Apparently, both Cassidy and Young were convinced to support Kennedy and Gabbard, respectively, after phone calls with Vice President J.D. Vance. There's also a ton of pressure here from hardliners. Keep in mind that Cassidy in Louisiana is facing re-election in 2026. He's one of the 30-something senators who are up next cycle. And there was a lot of talk that, especially given the fact that back in 2021, he was one of the handful of Republicans that voted to convict the president on January 6th and on impeachment, that ultimately Republicans would not let him also get away with this. They would not forgive him for this, and they would bring him down. So you've seen this a number of times here from Republicans. It's no accident that you have Elon Musk now there, the richest man in the world, willing to spend money, saying, I will support people who are running against you and take you down if you don't get in line here. So you see Republicans, whether it was Joni Ernst of Iowa and Pete Hegseth, now Cassidy on Kennedy, now Todd Young on Gabbard, holdouts who go public, they get a lot of pressure and the squeeze from the White House here. So we're going to watch those final votes, see if they get through. And the last one will be Kash Patel, but in comparison to these others, it looks like he will also get through here as the next FBI director.
Okay, time for the speed read. An update now on the plane collision over Washington, D.C. From NBC News. Authorities have recovered all of the 67 victims from the Potomac River less than a week after an American Airlines flight collided with a military helicopter in the Washington, D.C. area. Search and recovery efforts are over after the crash last Wednesday, with 66 people identified. The chief medical examiner's office is still working to identify the final victim. Officials called it a significant step to bring closure after the collision. Authorities will turn to clearing the wreckage from the river. The NTSB is investigating the cause of that crash last Wednesday night when that American Airlines flight traveling from Wichita, Kansas, collided with an Army Black Hawk helicopter outside of Reagan National Airport in Arlington, Virginia. There were 3 soldiers on the helicopter. There were 64 people on board the commercial flight, including many young Olympic hopefuls that were traveling back from a figure skating competition. A total of 28 people on the plane were connected to ice skating, including coaches, athletes, and their relatives.
So the cockpit voice recorder and the flight data recorder have been recovered from the plane. The black boxes are at a lab for evaluation right now. All of that data from the plane's devices, as well as the helicopter's black box, are expected to show data and results here. The skies were clear on the night of the crash, so it doesn't appear that weather played a significant role. We've told you one of the issues they're zeroing in on is why the chopper, the military chopper, was flying 100 to 150 feet above where it should have been. So it was flying 300 to 350 feet in the air. The passenger plane was at 325 feet. You can see the issue there. Now, the thing is, the helicopter had a 200-foot ceiling on it, meaning don't go above 200 feet. What was it doing 100 to 150 feet above where it should have been? Why did the pilots do that? Now, there's plausible explanations, like a flock of birds or other issues that would lead a helicopter pilot to have to move up or try to change elevation there. And that's something they're going to try to get to the bottom of. The plane was where it was supposed to be. The helicopter was not. What led it to go there? What changes need to be made will be one of the big questions we ask here in the coming weeks and months. And again, we put together a special edition of the podcast that was out over the weekend with Peter Greenberg, where we went over all of these things in terms of what could have happened, what will need to change here, especially given the unique situation in D.C., where you have Reagan Airport 2 miles away from the White House, 2 miles from the Capitol, a bunch of military sites next to the Pentagon. And you got choppers from a variety of organizations, agencies, military, et cetera, flying all around and in between the paths and sometimes crossing the paths of the flights landing there.
From the Wall Street Journal, President Trump getting serious about getting rid of the Department of Education, talking Tuesday about issuing an executive order calling on Congress to abolish the department. Congressional approval is required to abolish any federal agency. Legislation to eliminate the agency would require a supermajority. That means 60 votes to pass in the Senate. And that means it would require support from at least 7 Democrats. Highly unlikely. But Trump does have a lot of options short of complete elimination. He could try on his own without Congress. The Trump administration is also considering significant cuts to programs and staff within the Department of Ed, and that includes executive actions to shut down programs that are not protected by federal law. The president emphasizing that closing the department would give states more control over education. However, states already handle most aspects of curriculum and school funding. So, Moshe, what exactly does the federal Department of Ed do that the states and local school districts do not?
Yeah, we should mention it's one of the newest departments. It's the smallest federal department. It was created in the 1970s out of the Department of Labor. Carter did it, and that's always been an issue for Republicans. They're like, this thing was not necessary, and various Republican presidents over time have said, close the federal Department of Ed. That said, over time here, it's taken on a number of responsibilities. Managing federal student loan programs, enforcing laws for students with disabilities, administering Title I programs for low-income students, so supplementing funding for areas that don't have much of a tax base. Now, Trump has said that the results here from testing show that something needs to change here, that the U.S. spends some of the most on education per pupil in the world. And ultimately, the testing has shown that we're not anywhere near first place. And in various categories, we're in the top 10. In some categories, we're in the 20s when you compare us to other developing countries. Trump threw out, we're 40 out of 40. I don't know where he got that. The latest numbers show we're 6th in reading, 10th in science, and 26th in math. So certainly room for improvement. And as far as the Republicans are concerned, that improvement will come if you just dump whatever funding goes into the federal department into the various states and localities, though, as you mentioned, the curriculum, most of the funding already comes from locals and states. Now, you also mentioned that Congress needs to, if you need Congress to either create an agency or department, and you need Congress to end an agency or department, and Congress ain't going to do this. The House likely would vote this direction, though it's very narrow and some Republicans might have an issue. But even then, getting to the Senate, you're going to need 60 votes, filibuster-proof majority, which means you get all Republicans plus 7 Democrats to take apart the Department of Education. That ain't happening. So what is he doing here? What did he learn from his first term? What if I don't completely abolish the agency, but I sort of gut it inside, fire people, cut funding from it? Sort of what he's doing to USAID right now is sort of a test case for the Department of Education. And so that, the question there is how much executive authority does he have over that if he sort of goes that route as opposed to the official route of going through Congress and trying to abolish the agency. And that's a lot of what you're seeing in Trump 2.0 here is places where he hit a wall last time, he's going to take a different direction. I found it remarkable yesterday. He was asked, what's the point of nominating a Secretary of Education, Linda McMahon from the WWE? She still has to face her confirmation hearings. If you're going to give her the mission of taking apart the agency that she was just named the head of. And he's like, that's the whole point. I've given her the job to make her own job useless. So we will see what happens with education here. Already you're seeing protests outside the Treasury Department, protests outside the USAID. And I should mention on USAID, they have effectively blocked out all the employees. They have announced the closure of all the overseas missions and ordered all staff around the world. We're talking more than 100 countries here, Jill. Everyone has to come home. It's over. And that was the order that was given out yesterday. They said everyone has to be home by Friday. USAID, a $40 billion, 10,000-person agency with tens of thousands of contractors around the world in charge of disaster relief, health and medical aid, emergency food programs, malaria, dealing with kids in poverty, kids who are sick, but also some controversial programs that the Trump administration has brought up in relation to DEI and other matters that they find a major waste of money and not the priorities. And so they decided to try to shut the whole thing down. And so this thing continues to escalate, this agency looking to be folded into the State Department. And so if you thought the USAID situation is controversial, ratchet it up by 100x if he tries to do something like this over the Department of Education.
From USA Today, maybe that pesky groundhog was right. At least Puxatawny Phil. Winter is continuing to rear its ugly head this week across the Midwest and the Northeast, courtesy of a potent storm that is forecast to spread a nasty mix of ice and snow today and tomorrow.
But we should note, Jill, this is not what Staten Island Chuck predicted. This takes us in Phil's direction, despite his terrible track record.
Yes, figured 2025 would be like the 1 year he gets right. The National Weather Service warning of a widespread, impactful freezing rain event from the Midwest across the lower peninsula of Michigan into the mid-Atlantic states today and then into southern New England tomorrow. The highest ice storm potential, we're talking about a 1/4 inch or more of ice accretion, is expected from western Maryland north into Pennsylvania, where you'll likely see scattered power outages and tree damage. And then a much larger area from Washington to Baltimore, Philadelphia, New York, and Boston, also expecting to see a briefer period of icing.
So look for potential tree damage here, which could lead to power outages, likely due to ice. Travel is going to be challenging, and so you could see hazardous conditions on tonight's evening commute, tomorrow morning as well. And while you think you're out of it when you avoid the snow, it's the ice storms that could be even worse at times, very incredibly dangerous, treacherous driving conditions on bridges, highways, ramps in a matter of seconds with these ice storms. And so that is one of the major concerns here. So be closely watching your local weather forecasts.
And from CNBC, the Waffle House restaurant chain putting a 50-cent per egg surcharge in place, thanks to the biggest bird flu outbreak in a decade. The 24/7 restaurant said that the resulting egg shortage has led to a dramatic increase in its costs. Bird flu is forcing farmers to slaughter millions of chickens a month, pushing U.S. egg prices to more than double their cost in the summer of 2023. And unfortunately, it appears there may be no relief in sight with Easter approaching.
Yes, a big egg buying time period. The average price of eggs nationwide, when you take the overall 50-state average, just over $4.15. 2 years ago was the record at $4.82. Though, honestly, Jill, I keep hearing from people who are like, I'm having a hard time finding a dozen eggs for less than $9 or $8 or $10, depending on where you live. Some of you actually saying you're getting into the chicken raising business in your backyard to partially deal with the price of eggs as we anticipated. The avian flu is a huge issue, and it's not going away, given that now it's jumped to the cattle and other animals. And so previously with avian flu situations, it would burn itself out. They would kill off the chickens who had it and would go away for a while. But now that avian flu has adapted and moved to other species, that means it's incredibly difficult to stop it. In many of those species, like the cows, for example, you don't see symptoms. And so that's one of the challenges they're having here. But good luck finding eggs back at the $2 or $3 a dozen prices that we once took for granted. All right, we end here with On This Day in History. And Jill, I understand some people are saying that some of these On This Days in History on these days, they're getting repetitious now that we're a couple of years into the podcast. I will say this, I try my best to find new stuff for a date every year, but it turns out that sometimes, there's good stuff. And if you happen to be listening last year on February 5th, you might remember a couple of these. And I hope that's okay with all of you. Jill, is it okay with you? Do I have permission to proceed?
Moshe, you did get a little defensive when I told you that somebody had given me that feedback. You're like, well, what do you want me to do?
What do you want me to do? Change history? Find more interesting things that happen on that day? You find me. I want someone to go through the rest of the calendar and find me interesting things for the next 310 days or so we have left of this year. And I will happily incorporate them into the podcast.
Whereas I thought you were going to take it as kind of like a compliment that people are listening closely enough that they remember what we did for On This Day day the year prior. So let's just think of it as a good thing.
Okay, fine. Noted. I will take it as a compliment. Thank you guys for listening so closely and remembering our podcast, the end of each podcast.
And that constructive criticism comes from my friend Mark.
Mark,
FYI.
We're preparing tomorrow's podcast right now. I want you to dig up some stuff about February 6th that wasn't on last year's podcast. All right, 3, 2, 1 here. On this day in 1937, FDR proposes increasing the size of the Supreme Court. Mark, you might remember this from last year. So FDR he was frustrated by how conservative the court was. So he tried to, what they call pack the court and expand it from 9 to 15 justices. That didn't end up happening for him. Fast forward to 1962. Mark, what am I about to say? On this day in history, Ringo Starr makes his first live appearance with the Beatles. He fills in for drummer Pete Best, who was ill. This is a word to the wise. Don't get sick if you're in the Beatles, because they will replace you with the next drummer. And so Ringo Starr played a couple shows. They liked him so much, he joins the Beatles. And so Ringo Starr joins the Fab Four on this day in history. Fast forward to 2003, a little political international history here. Secretary of State Colin Powell goes before the UN Security Council. Some of us might remember this. He brought some props with him to showcase what he said was U.S. evidence of WMDs in Iraq. That turned out to be a major intelligence failure. He called it a blot on his own record, regrets that announcement. It was basically why the U.S. would go into Iraq, and we'd find out later that Iraq wasn't actually building weapons of mass destruction. We end here with a bit of TV history on this day. I don't know if Mark was a big fan of Supermarket Sweep, but I was. And so on this day, 35 years ago, on Lifetime, the revival of Supermarket Sweep, love that show, where you need to know the price of everything in the grocery store. Always fill your cart with hams, I think it was the lesson I took away from that show. If you're trying to get to the highest number.
So the irony with Supermarket Sweep is that we watched it when we were kids and we were not going shopping in the supermarket. And yet, I watched it thinking that I could do a good job. Now that I go shopping in the supermarket, I never know where anything is. I clearly complain all the time about grocery prices. So yeah, not as fun as Supermarket Sweep made it out to be.
No, not when you're going to the grocery store with your own money, though. Jill, given the totals you tell me you're spending at the grocery store, you'd kill it on Supermarket Sweep, where the goal was to spend as much money as possible.
You're trying to drive up the costs.
Yeah. We end here with a bit of music history. One of my faves for karaoke comes out on this day. 42 years ago, Africa by Toto. Dun, 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 dun. Notably, fun fact, Mark, you might remember this. I mentioned this last year. Africa almost didn't make the album. Apparently, a couple of the band members said the song is dumb. The lyrics are goofy. As sure as Kilimanjaro rises like Olympus above the Serengeti. So it was the last song they recorded, and it barely made the cut for the album. Oh, Toto, I can't believe you almost left that one on the cutting room floor.
Moshe, I don't know if you remember, Weezer actually did a remake of Africa. And the weirdest thing is, it was they didn't change anything. It basically sounded exactly like the original. And I remember my husband and I were like, if you're going to do a remake, make it your own. And it's just it sounds, you're just kind of is this the remake or is this the original? Right.
Do what Whitney Houston did to
exactly
Dolly Parton's I Will Always Love You, and really kind of own it and make it your own. But I don't know, Weezer. Island in the Sun is still a solid song. I enjoy that when it comes on the Spotify.
I'm a big Weezer fan, so I think I was maybe just a little bit disappointed. Perhaps I need to get a life. Perhaps I need to move on. All right, guys. Thank you for listening to the Mo News podcast. If you like what you hear, please share this with your friends. It will help us grow. Follow us, subscribe so you don't miss an episode, and review us in the App Store.
And Mark, everybody else, if you have important historical dates that you know of, fun historical things that you would enjoy hearing, other people would enjoy hearing on this day in history, email us, DM us, info@mo.news. Always looking for new stuff. We have 365 days until the next February 5th.
All right, guys, that's your assignment. See you tomorrow.